very much. And I'm very pleased we're all here, and we're going to start off with Merlin and Cosmo, who are going to sing to us. But I'd just like to say one word first about the orchard. It's one of my favourite parts of Hollyhock, and although the garden and the lodge are very well known to everyone, not everyone sees the orchard. It's never looked better than it does at the moment. Yeah. It's got a lot of new trees. It's going to be immensely productive in a few years' time. It's already productive. And some of the older trees are looking great. So it's a very good cause, and one of the ones I feel most strongly about here at Hollyhock. So I'm very glad this is dedicated to the orchard this evening. And now I'm going to hand over to Merlin and Cosmo, who are going to start us with a song.
I'd also like to welcome to the stage Heather Wolf, who's going to be joining us in this song. We're going to sing a song called The Queen of Hearts. To the Queen of Hearts is the ace of sorrow. He's here today, and he's gone tomorrow. Young men are plenty, but sweethearts few. If my love should leave me, then what should I do? I love my mother, I love my father, I love my sister, I love my friends and relatives too. I'd forsake them all to go with you. Had I the store on yonder mountain with gold and silver there for counting, I could not count for want of thee, mine eyes so full I could not see. To the Queen of Hearts is the ace of sorrow. He's here today, and he's gone tomorrow. Young men are plenty, but sweethearts few. If my love should leave me, then what should I do?
Well, thank you so much. This is a presenter evening because about 10 days ago, Merlin, Cosmo and I were giving a workshop here at Hollyhock called Science and Spiritual Practices. So the presenter evening's got a bit displaced from our actual workshop. Anyway, that's the theme of what I'm talking about this evening. Although there's been a decline in organized religion in the West, there's been a tremendous increase in an interest in spiritual practices. And there are now there's more spiritual practices available than ever before. We have access to practically all the world's religious traditions. This is a unique situation. It's also the case that for the first time these practices are being investigated scientifically. So personally I'm very interested in this because I'm a scientist and I also do these various spiritual practices. They're part of my life. And this is the theme of my two most recent books, which are really the same book, it's just in two parts. The first part, which was published in North America last year, is called Science and Spiritual Practices. And the second part, which is coming out in North America in print form next month, already in ebook and audiobook, is called Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, a title that my wife Jill Peirce suggested. I think it's a really good title. Because what it's about, and what all these practices are about going beyond our normal everyday states of consciousness into experiences which connect us. They connect us with each other, and they connect us with the more than human world, to use David Abrams' phrase. And they connect us with realms of consciousness beyond the human level. And usually when we feel connected in this way, we feel happy. When we're disconnected, we usually feel miserable, alienated, depressed. These studies on science and spiritual practices over the last 30 or 40 years have increased in number, and there are now literally thousands of papers on these subjects in peer-reviewed scientific journals. They were summarized in two huge handbooks called the Handbooks of Religion and Health. And what these handbooks show is basically that these practices, religious and spiritual practices, make people happier, healthier, and live longer. And this is a surprising fact, in a sense, in a modern scientific secular world. These practices have been dismissed by many secularists for a long time as a waste of time. But it turns out that they're a key to happiness and health, highly relevant both individually and collectively. It also means, presumably, that the opposite is true. If you don't do these practices, you'll be unhappier, unhealthier, and live shorter, which is why I think militant atheism should come with a health warning. Because insofar as militant atheists persuade people to give up their traditional religious practices, they give up these a whole range of spiritual practices as well, and they're left with none of these practices if they take militant atheism seriously. This is something that atheists themselves now recognize. And the new generation of atheists is actually taking up spiritual practices. Sam Harris, one of the so-called new atheists, is now giving online meditation courses. Alain de Botton, one of our most prominent atheist philosophers in Britain, has written a book called Religion for Atheists, reinventing religious practices for atheists. And in Britain, we now have an atheist church called the Sunday Assembly, where people gather on Sunday mornings to sing happy songs and tell uplifting stories. And in fact, after a few years of it being called the Atheist Church, they now want to rebrand it as mystical humanism. So there's a very interesting move going on here. And people who do spiritual practices are no longer necessarily religious. There are many people who are spiritual but not religious who do spiritual practices. And there are even atheists who are doing a range of spiritual practices. So the dividing line used to be between religious people and non-religious people. And now there's a whole spectrum of all the ways in between. In my first book, Science and Spiritual Practices, I discuss 7 different practices, which are meditation, on which there have now been many studies on the physiology, the brain scans, the effects on health and well-being. Gratitude, which is one of the great central themes of positive psychology, the form of psychology that studies what makes people happy, as opposed to the forms of psychology, most of them that study what make people miserable. And positive psychologists have found that grateful people are, generally speaking, happy people. They're also better liked by others. They're more fun to be with. I mean, in a sense, it's obvious, but it's now been scientifically proved. And they've actually shown that they're not grateful because they're happy because they're grateful. And if you do gratefulness exercises, then you feel happier. And they've shown this through many simple experiments, which have a remarkable effect. It's the simplest of all the spiritual practices. Anyone can do it any day. A lot of people do it before meals, traditionally, giving thanks before meals. In our own family, we usually do it holding hands silently or saying a grace or singing a grace. But many families have given up the regular traditional practices of gratitude, but bringing them back in a new form is actually very transformative and costs nothing. Of course, in North America, anything gets monetized, and you can now buy very expensive gratitude journals in gift shops. But you don't actually need to spend that money. Any bit of paper will do if you want to make lists, or you can do it on your computer or phone. But gratitude is a spiritual practice that's part of all religions and is available to anyone, whether within or outside a religious context. Then the third practice in science and spiritual practice is connecting with the more than human world, relating to the natural world, which for many people, including me, is a sense, gives a great sense of connection. And why it's important is because we're normally encased in a very human world. When we relate to the natural world, and a lot of people on Cortes Island do that, I know, that's why many of us are here. There's a much greater sense of connection than you get just within the sphere of humans, because there's so much more in the more than human world than there is in the human world. The next chapter in that book is on relating to plants, and there I discuss primarily trees and flowers, which are a very important part of my own life. I started out as a botanist, and I spend time with plants every day, and so do many other people. In Britain, gardening is the most popular hobby, and here in Hollyhock, we're always reminded of the importance of flowers and plants by walking in every day through this beautiful garden and being surrounded by these magnificent trees. Then singing and chanting are a very basic spiritual practice, again, in all traditions. This is something I've learned most about from my wife, Jill Peirce, who's pioneered re-establishing new forms of group chanting based on traditions found all over the world. And singing and chanting is a way of connecting with each other, because when we sing, we literally come into resonance with each other, and also with the more than human world. So chants, especially spiritual chants, including mantras, are a way of connecting with each other and with the spiritual dimension. Then rituals are found in all religions and in secular cultures, like the American Thanksgiving dinner, or the Jewish Passover, the Christian Holy Communion, the rituals of India, in the Brahminic rituals in the Indian temples. All cultures have their rituals. I think these are important because they bring people together and they connect those who do them in the present with those who've done them before. This is my own theory of morphic resonance. If you do things in a similar way to the way they're done before, there's a kind of resonance across time, giving connections between members of the present group and also with those who've gone before. And the final practice in my first book is pilgrimage. And there's a tremendous resurgence of pilgrimage going on in Europe at the moment. The most famous is the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. But there's a resurgence in all parts of England and Europe. And in Britain, there's an organization called the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is reopening the old footpath pilgrimage routes to the holy places of England and the rest of the British Isles. So those are the 7 practices I talk about in science and spiritual practices. Now, in this new book, about to appear in print form, Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work, I talk about 7 more, and I'll speak about some of them in detail, but I'll first give you just a summary of the main themes. The first is on sports, and for many people this seems surprising. Most people think of sports as supremely secular. Yet, I think this is the most common way in which people in the modern world enter altered states of consciousness. And I shall come back to that in a minute, because I think it's a really important aspect to re-evaluate and reappreciate what's going on through sports. The second chapter is on learning from animals. And again, most people don't think of this as a spiritual practice. But I think that for many people, including me, animals can have very valuable lessons for us, and of both about our own nature and about the wider nature of things, and I'll again come back to that. Then the next chapter in this book is on fasting. I shall come back to that again in a few minutes. Fasting is found in all religious traditions. It's a very simple practice to do, and like most of the other ones, it's free. Actually, this one's more than free. You actually save money. Then I have a chapter on spiritual openings through cannabis and psychedelics. Many people have had the experience of opening to the spiritual realm through mind-altering drugs. I'm one such person myself, which is why I included this chapter in the book. And again, I'll return to that theme soon. Then there's a chapter on prayer, petitionary prayer, asking for things. Probably the most common practice all around the world in all religious traditions, and even among many people who are not religious. Prayer is different from meditation. In meditation, you're letting go of concerns about the world. You're closing your eyes. You're becoming still. You're not doing anything. You're letting thoughts keep going through your mind, but you don't attach to them. And it's a kind of withdrawal from engagement with thoughts, with action, practice, and intention. Petitionary prayer is the opposite. It goes in the opposite direction. You start with an invocation to a spiritual being to whom you're praying. Our Father, who art in heaven, Hail Mary, full of grace, Om Namah Shivaya. With the being to whom you're praying, you invoke at the beginning of the prayer, and then connect that spiritual being with your concerns, worries, and intentions for healing, for inspiration, for protection. People pray about all sorts of things that are very much part of the mundane, everyday world, but giving a spiritual dimension to those aspects of the world. I see prayer and meditation as a bit like breathing in and breathing out. Both are necessary, and I think they're complementary. I myself meditate every morning and I pray every evening before I go to bed. And so I see these as not one or the other. In fact, my whole point in these books, and the whole point that I'm trying to get across this evening, is there's many practices, and it's not that you do one and not the others. You can do them all. And some suit some people better than others. Some work better at some times of life than others. But they're complementary, they're not exclusive. Then holy days and festivals. All traditions have holy days and festivals. And holy days are literally holidays. It's the same word. You can't have a holy day where you celebrate together unless it's a holiday. You can't do it if you're all at work. So holy days and holidays are the same thing, really. Again, if I have time, I'll come back to that theme. And finally, the final practice is being kind. Because if you don't have a sort of framework of helping others and helping the world, then you might have a great time meditating. You might feel you're contacting great spiritual realms. You might have an amazing acid trip where you feel you've had incredible revelations. But unless this helps other people, unless it helps the wider world, then it's basically somewhat selfish, even though it may give you a great spiritual buzz. So I think it's very important to have this wider context. So that's an overview, and this is, of course, not an exhaustive list of all spiritual practices. There are many more, including yoga, qigong, service to others, art, making and appreciating art, and others still beyond that. But I'm going to come back now to sports. One of the purposes of meditation is to come into the present. And one of the things that brain scans show is that when people are meditating, there's a closing down of the default mode network, which is a series of regions in the brain which are concerned with ruminations, worries, fantasies, fears, anxieties, the internal dialogue, the chatter of the mind that goes on when we're not doing anything else. That's why it's called the default mode network. It's what kicks in when you're not doing something else. And one of the aims of meditation is to let go of that ceaseless chatter and help it to have some gaps in it. by concentrating on the breathing or on a mantra. And brain scans show that indeed the default mode network becomes much less active when you're meditating. And then you come much more into the present. But sports provide an extremely effective way of doing that, very much quicker than meditation. And I first realized how powerful that was through a conversation with Gifford Pinchot, who's here this evening on this island, who told me that when he was at his busiest and his mind was most active, meditation was hard to do. It was hard to still the mind. But when he was 50 feet up a rock face, he felt completely in the present. And I think this is true of sports in general. If you're skiing downhill at 60 miles an hour and you go around a corner and there's a cliff on one side, you have to be completely in the present. If you're in the middle of a football match and someone's passing the ball to you and crowds are cheering, you're totally in the present. If you're riding a motorbike in a motorbicycle race at over 100 miles an hour, you're completely in the present. A second or two of lapsed attention and you're dead. And I think that's one reason why in the modern world the thrill of speed is so popular with a lot of people, because sports that involve traveling fast, jet skiing and lots of other sports that involve very rapid movement, are ones in which you have to be completely present. You immediately snap out of the default mode network, you're totally present. And I think the rise of dangerous sports and extreme sports is partly a reaction to a world in which everyone's obsessed with liability, litigation, minimization of risk, health and safety. And extreme sports are the exact opposite of all that. They're sports which are gratuitously dangerous. Someone I know in England was one of the founders of the Dangerous Sports Club in England, and their club tie involves a man in a wheelchair on it. So, I mean, these are dangerous sports. So he was a pioneer of long-distance bungee jumping. But, jumping out of aeroplanes, skydiving, free diving to 200 feet, these dangerous sports, there's free climbing up skyscrapers with no ropes or up El Capitan. And these are sports which force people to be totally in the present. They therefore give this sense of presence which can give to many people a spiritual opening. Many people have spiritual experiences doing sports. They don't often talk about it to fellow sports people, but there are now many accounts on record, and I've been collecting such stories myself. So in team games, there's also the feeling of connection and relationship with others, that sense of immense commitment and immersion in the group. And again, this sense of connection is a key feature of spiritual practice, and team games give that. So there are other sports where this is more explicit. In the martial arts, in the Orient, it's always been taken for granted that there's a spiritual dimension of sports, and the flow of qi being part of that flow of energy that works through the whole of nature, which is flowing through you and through your opponent in the martial arts. The martial arts are about being in the flow and being in mastery of that flow. In that famous book, Zen and the Art of Archery, published in the 1950s, the German author, Herigel, wrote about how he'd studied for years with a Zen master in Japan to learn archery. And it was a matter of learning it so skillfully that when you actually fired the arrow, you weren't firing. It was just, as it were, firing itself and just going to the target. And he talks in a very mystical way about this practice, so the spiritual dimension's been much more appreciated in the East than in the West. Michael Murphy, who founded the Esalen Institute in 1962, is one of the people who's pointed out the spiritual side of sports, and indeed he thinks of sports as the yoga of the West. And he thinks it's one of the areas in which human capacities and potentials are evolving most rapidly at the present time. We normally think of technological innovation, intellectual innovation, but actually in sports, think of all the new sports: snowboarding, skydiving, hang gliding, skateboarding, all these many, many new sports, all of which involve new technologies, new groups of muscles, new skills, new abilities. This is a field of human evolution which is pushing the very boundaries of humanity, and which takes those who do these things into altered states of consciousness, which are very important for them. So, one of the points I want to end this thing on sports by saying is, what is it that makes a sport? And what philosophers of sports have come up with is that the common factor is physical skill. There are games that are not sports, like chess. There are sports that are not games, like mountain climbing. But what sports have in common, including blood sports, hunting, stalking deer, and that kind of thing, and field sports, and solitary sports, like things you do on your own, and team sports, what they all have in common is physical skill. And in order to get into that state of being in the flow, in the present, then you have to have enough skill to do it. So they involve discipline, like other spiritual practices do. And when you've achieved a sufficient level, then you can enter that state of flow, and which, for many people, I think is the principal way in which they escape from the mundane consciousness of the modern world, social media, commercials, advertising, worries. For them, for millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, sports are the principal way they do it. Now, fasting. Fasting, again, is present in all religious traditions. Jewish people fast on Yom Kippur, Christians fast during Lent, Muslims in Ramadan during the daylight hours. Hindus have various fast days. In shamanic cultures, people often fast before rites of passage or rituals or on vision quests. So fasting is very widely practiced. It's also something very deep in our physiology. It's extraordinarily unusual for people to have 3 big meals a day. Our ancestors and our pre-human ancestors didn't get fed all the time. There were days they went without food, whether they liked it or not. Or hunter-gatherers have times of plenty when there's lots of fruit or there's plenty of game to hunt. But they also have times of scarcity when there's not much food and where they have to fast or starve for days, weeks on end. And this is true of the entire animal kingdom. The whole of the animal kingdom and the microbial and the fungal world have evolved in conditions of intermittent food supply. And the whole physiology is geared to that. If you deprive the bacterium E. coli of food, it lives much longer than similar cells that are fed all the time. If you deprive yeast, a fungus, of food, it lives much longer. If you deprive mice of food by feeding them every other day instead of every day, they live 30% longer, a whole year longer than mice that eat every day. We've evolved, like these other living organisms, with intermittent food supplies. And when people are fasting, several things happen. The physiology of the body changes. First of all, you go over to burning fats. And most of us have enough fat in our body to last us a very long time. Calculations show that the average American could walk from New York to Florida just using the available fat reserves in their bodies. So we burn fats instead of carbohydrates. We use up the liver glycogen. The supply of carbohydrates in the liver is used up within about 12 hours. Then you move over to metabolizing fats. When you're in this mode, the body burns up not just fats, but also senescent cells, which cause inflammation. Some people think that these persistent senescent cells are one of the root causes of Alzheimer's and other inflammatory diseases. In fasting, those cells are removed. The body is detoxified. Growth hormone is released, and there's a kind of rejuvenating effect on the cells of the body. So it's extremely good for most people to fast. It's the cheapest and simplest life-enhancing, health-enhancing, and life-extending thing you could do. Now, it's not advisable for everybody. I'm not saying that people who've got terrible diseases, who are on lots of medications, who are suffering from anorexia and so on should fast. But for most people in this room, it would be one of the simplest and most effective ways of improving health. And in fact, I think that if national health services and health insurance companies promoted fasting, they'd greatly increase the general health, and greatly reduce medical expenditure. I think it's something which can be done by anybody. If you don't feel confident, you can have guides from naturopaths or Ayurvedic practitioners or others who specialize in fasting. But there are now some very good books on fasting. The best I know is by a Canadian doctor, Jason Fung. It's called The Complete Guide to Fasting. But there are plenty of other books and guides to this. I myself fast every year during Lent. I'm a practicing Christian and Anglican. So I fast during Holy Week, just before Easter. This year I did 4 days, some days a week, some days 3 days. It's several days anyway, and I'm sure, how many people here have tried fasting for more than 2 days? Oh, well, that's a lot of people. That's at least half, more than half. Well, then you'll probably find what I found, which is that after the first day you don't really feel very hungry anymore. The first day is the worst, and then it gets easier. And I myself find that when I do this, the day seems much longer, there's more time to do things, my mind is clearer. I have enough energy to go about normal activities. I do it when I've got a space in my diary. I keep free from social engagements. Obviously, it's not much fun to go to a dinner party when you're fasting. So it's best to have a gap in your diary when you don't have to do things like that. But it's... I find that a clarity of mind, I find it easier to meditate and pray, and I have more vivid dreams. And I think it's because of this mind-altering effect of fasting that it's been done in so many traditions. The chemical changes in the blood involve ketosis, the formation of ketone bodies, acetoacetic acid, beta-hydroxybutyric acid, and acetone. Beta-hydroxybutyric acid is very closely related to the neurotransmitter gamma-aminobutyric acid, and also to gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, GHB, which is a street drug because it's a euphoric. These are neurotransmitters, and when you're fasting, the ketone bodies in the blood shift the neurotransmitter levels in the brain. Fasting is psychoactive. Anyway, it's a spiritual practice. I think what it does is it doesn't in itself cause a spiritual experience, but it creates a way in which you can more easily carry out other spiritual practices like prayer and meditation. Now, talking of altered states of consciousness through changes in the brain, I come to psychedelics and cannabis. I myself found that I went through a phase of being a scientific materialist and atheist. This went along with the package deal of my scientific education. And I thought, as atheists and materialists do, that my mind was nothing but the brain. Everything could eventually be explained by science, and most already was explained by science, I thought. I thought we lived in a material universe which was largely unconscious and had no purpose. Well, when I first took cannabis, my ideas changed in almost an instant. I was traveling in India in 1968 on my way to Malaysia, where I was working on tropical rainforest plants. And in Delhi, I met a friend of mine from Cambridge, an anthropologist, who was doing field work in a village in the Himalayas. We met by chance. He was the only person I knew in India. And he said, "Would you like to come back to my village?" And so I said yes, and I went to his village. It took 2 days to get there. We had to walk the last 10 or 12 miles. And he'd been there for 2 years. He knew all the people in the village. He spoke the local language, Pahadi. And we were going for a walk and chatting to people. And we walked along a beautiful valley with a rushing stream, and there was a cave by it, and a man in orange robes sitting in the cave. And I said, "Who's that?" And he said, "Oh, he's the local holy man, the sadhu." And he waved to us and beckoned to us. So we went and joined him in his cave. And then he produced a little clay thing, which I said, "What's that?" He said, "It's called a chillum." and he filled it with material and invited me to smoke it. I'd not smoked cannabis before, and I didn't know what this was. But I smoked it, and it was obviously a fairly powerful blend. And I had this tremendously altered state of consciousness. I felt utterly blissful. I went out of the cave, and there were the mountains, the Himalayas, snow on the top of them, this beautiful valley, this amazing sea. I just felt my life had been transformed, a sense of connection I hadn't had before. So for me, this was a kind of gateway experience to spiritual practices. A couple of years later, in Cambridge, I took LSD for the first time. And this, again, was a completely revelatory experience. No one in my scientific education had told me anything about this sort of thing. I mean, I was thinking in terms of neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin in the brain. I'd studied brain physiology. But nothing had prepared me for this LSD experience. And I realized there was vastly more to the mind than I'd ever thought before. So both of these experiences for me were like rites of passage or spiritual openings. And I think for many people today, psychedelics play that kind of role. Actually, this is the first time I've been in a room where I've felt free to ask this question. But how many people here have felt they've had a kind of spiritual opening through cannabis? Quite a few. How many through psychedelics? I would say a majority. Thank you. Yes. Well, I think that this is a major feature of the modern world, and I think the fact that psychedelic research is now legal again, that the whole discussion has become mainstream, partly through Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which I think is a very good introduction to the subject. I think means that the possibility of psychedelics playing a really catalytic role in consciousness change in our culture is growing. I mean, they've had that role for decades, but it's been driven underground. And I think there could be proper rites of passage. There are already psychedelic churches like Santo Daime, the Brazilian ayahuasca-taking church. And I think we're going to see a lot of evolution in this area as psychedelics are incorporated into religious and spiritual practices, rather than just being things people take illegally at parties under ill-advised conditions. I think there's a really positive possibilities here. Of course, the question then arises of what are they actually doing? If you're an atheist, and many atheists and materialists take psychedelics and get a lot from doing that, there's no reality outside your brain, no conscious reality outside your brain, so it's all just inside the head. But for many people who take psychedelics, there's the experience that our consciousness is opening up to a greater form of consciousness than our own. Certainly that's what I experience. A materialist would say that's just an illusion. There is no greater form of consciousness than our own. But I think for many people who take psychedelics, the experience itself suggests something like that. We're part of a larger conscious reality. There are many forms of consciousness beyond our own. And psychedelics provide direct evidence of that. Now, if you continue with the materialist point of view, basically you're putting theory before experience. You're putting a theory that the world consists of inanimate matter before your own direct experience. And it's a choice everyone has to make. Do you trust a theory, which is notoriously bad at explaining consciousness, over the direct experience of consciousness itself? Well, I, for one, would opt for the direct experience. Now, learning from animals. I myself have learned a lot from animals. And I think one of the things that we can learn from animals is a kind of humility, because although we like to think of ourselves as humans more important than any other being in the world, that we're totally in charge of everything else, we have the right of life and death over any other forms of life. We don't over other humans, but we do over animals. You can buy animals, you can kill them if you want, you can go around hunting them. They can be produced by the billions, as chickens are in battery farms for human consumption in factory farms. I mean, we have a very bad relationship with a lot of animals on this earth, including driving many species to extinction. But one of the things that we can learn from them is that they have abilities that far exceed our own. Some are much more sensitive in the realm of smell. Some can move much more gracefully, like gibbons jumping from tree to tree. No human could do that. Even a skilled acrobat can't do it as gracefully as these gibbons. Some have senses we don't have, like the electric senses of eels and some sharks. Some have other sensory abilities that we don't have, like echolocation in bats. Animals can do all sorts of things we can't do. And I think that's a lesson in humility. They also have the ability to be in the present. We have to go to a lot of trouble to have spiritual practices to bring us into the present. But most animals are right there already. You know, a cat sitting on your lap purring is purring because it's feeling happy and purring. It's not in the background, I imagine, worrying about where its food tomorrow is going to come from, or worrying about whether it's paid the bills, or and that sort of thing. It's not worrying about the kinds of things we worry about. And I think one of the reasons that so many people keep pets, cats, dogs, parrots, and other animals, and why so many people like riding horses, is that those animals bring us straight into the present. We have to be present with them if we're going to be with them, because they're completely in the present. So again, they shut down the default mode network. We come into the present with them, and they draw us into the present. If a dog is wanting you to throw a stick for it to retrieve, it's looking so completely present, completely engaged in this activity. Unless you're very churlish, it's very hard not to get engaged with it and brought into the present by it. So I think animals do that for us. And I think one of the other things they do is raise the question of what is the nature of spiritual experience? Can animals have spiritual experiences themselves? Well, personally, I don't see why not. I think if we take the view, which I do, that there's an underlying consciousness underlying the entire universe that shines through all conscious beings, including non-human animals, and that the ultimate nature of that consciousness is joyful or blissful, then why shouldn't animals contact it just as we can in certain states of mind? I think of a lizard basking in the sun may be in a state of samadhi-like bliss. A dolphin jumping through the bow waves of a boat in an obvious sense of pleasure at the freedom of movement and play, I think is completely in the present, just as many people are when doing sports like skiing. And birds singing beautiful songs are clearly enjoying the beauty of their songs, and other birds that listen to them are enjoying this beauty. They're in the present, and they're experiencing something that takes them beyond themselves. So I see no reason at all for supposing that animals are completely deprived of spiritual experiences. In fact, I think they motivate all beings, ultimately, some more consciously than others. But I see no reason to suppose that we're unique in this regard. Animals also teach us that about psychic abilities, because most of them are much more psychic than humans. I wrote a whole book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, about dogs that know when their owners are coming home, and also about cats that know when their owners are coming home, and many other intuitive powers of animals, including sensing earthquakes in advance and the amazing sense of direction that migratory animals and homing pigeons have. These psychic abilities we have as well, but human telepathy is much less well developed than among most animals. And I've done surveys of dog and cat owners, asking them about their animals' psychic abilities or what they think of as their psychic abilities. And most pet owners are convinced that their pets are much more psychic than they are themselves. And I think they're right. I think that the animals are much more attuned to this psychic level than we are. I think there's a distinction between the psychic and the spiritual. The psychic is about connections with other members of the group. Human telepathy occurs most commonly between mothers and babies, telephone telepathy between family members and friends. You think of someone who's planning to call you. it happens between people who are closely bonded socially. So it's about horizontal connections, as it were, and warnings of earthquakes and sense of direction, about finding homes, knowing about bad things that are going to happen in the future, a premonition of some disaster or a sense of warning. They're not really about a spiritual realm, but they take us beyond ourselves, they interconnect us. So I think there's a distinction between the psychic realm, which is more horizontal, and the spiritual realm, which is more vertical, or perhaps not just vertical, but connecting us with realms all around us that are beyond our social groups and beyond our immediate concerns. Finally, I want to say something about holy days and festivals. All cultures have holy days, and the earliest cultures we know about are those that left cave paintings in those caves in Spain and France and elsewhere in Europe. 30, 40,000 years ago, people went deep into caves and made paintings on the wall that looked like shamanic scenes of people turning into animals, and pictures of animals and of other beings. Now, in order to, it seems likely that these were at ceremonial centers, and many of the places with the paintings have acoustics which would reflect, would give a tremendous echo, a resonance to drumming or chanting in those places. And for people to gather in those places, they must have had holidays. They couldn't just nip in for a few minutes when they're not working, hunting or gathering. They would have had to have whole days off when the whole community had a day to celebrate together. And holy days are about times to celebrate together, where the whole community, families and other members of the community can come together. And these happen in seasonal festivals in all cultures. The most obvious in our own culture are festivals like Christmas and to some degree Easter. But in all cultures there are seasonal festivals which bring the whole community together. But there's also in the Judeo-Christian tradition the regular weekly holy days, the Sabbath. Jewish people are much better than most others at remembering the importance of this holy day when you don't work, sacred time. And sacred time creates a space in which people, the purpose is to celebrate together, to carry out spiritual practices, to sing, to dance, to make love, to have fun, to be together as a community. And then Christians have Sunday, and this traditionally had the same role in Christian cultures, and Muslims have Friday. But 24/7 modern secular culture hates Sabbaths and Sundays and things, because it means there are days when people aren't buying and selling and on Facebook all the time. So we're now in a world where these traditional holy days, which bring us together, are being eroded by secular commercial forces, which create a 24/7 culture, which is extremely harmful for people. There have now been studies on the importance of a day of rest or 2 days of rest, the weekend, on people's lifestyle, quality of life and health. And not surprisingly, they show that this is very important for people's sanity, well-being, and reducing this feeling of extreme stress that people get into through 24/7 culture. So now people are calling for the scientifically proven need for a 24/6 world, or technological Sabbaths, where you don't go on your devices for 24 hours. But I think all of us need to recover this sense of holy days, creating a space for collective celebration. And in some ways it's being reinvented in a secular context through summer music festivals. The Love Fest here on Cortes Island on Saturday was a very good example of that. People gathering together with no other purpose than to have fun and to be together and to be happy and to hear music and to celebrate. Just being together, the celebration of a summer festival. And in Europe there are many traditional festivals, summer festivals, St. John's Day, Midsummer's Day, Lammas, August the 2nd, are two of the main summer festivals where people celebrate together. And they've been reinvented in these summer music festivals, and I think a very important thing it is as well. I want to end by just discussing how it is that such very different spiritual practices can bring about this sense of connection or linkage. What do meditation and sports have in common, for example? It's not immediately obvious why such very different practices should have a spiritual dimension, why they should work as spiritual practices. And I think to discuss this, one has to think about the nature of consciousness itself. Now again, if you're a materialist and you think that consciousness is confined to brains, primarily to human brains, then you can still do spiritual practices like meditation or take drugs, psychedelics, and you can believe it's all just inside your head. But all traditional religions and traditional cultures take it for granted there are forms of consciousness beyond the human level. Our consciousness is not the ultimate consciousness of the universe. And there, in fact, there are many forms of consciousness: spirits, nature spirits, the spirits of ancestors, angels, demons, all sorts of spirits in most cosmologies, saints. And then an ultimate spirit. Many cultures have the idea of an ultimate consciousness, including all these many forms, both visible and invisible. And if we look at the general understanding of ultimate consciousness, what emerges is that there's much more similarity between different cultures' accounts than there are differences. In my favorite book in modern theology, a book called The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, Bliss by David Bentley Hart, an American theologian, H-A-R-T. He shows that in many cultures there's a similar model of ultimate consciousness or reality which underlies the whole universe and underlies all our own individual consciousnesses, which are like fractal versions of this ultimate consciousness. And it has three aspects. In Kashmiri Shaivism, they summarize it by saying these three aspects are the knower, the consciousness that can know things, that contains all things that are known, the known, that which is known within consciousness, and the means of knowledge, that which links them together. In the more normal Hindu version, it's the ultimate consciousness is Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat is the ground of being and consciousness, conscious ground of being. The ground of all being is conscious, and it has its intrinsic quality of being. It gives being to things. And Chit is what is known, what is in consciousness, the contents of consciousness, names and forms, nama rupa, as the Hindus put it. So all the things that can be known, the shapes, animals and plants, they have forms, names, all the forms of our language, all the contents of consciousness are within this ultimate divine consciousness as well. And then Ananda is bliss or joy. And an aspect of ultimate divine consciousness is that it's blissful. It doesn't lack anything. It's completely full and full of joy. Whereas if you lack something, you're always trying to get what you lack. But the divine consciousness is complete and joyful, and in all these models. The joy aspect is also dynamic. The Hindus call it Shakti, the feminine principle of energy. The Christian model is based on a Jewish model, and the Jewish model sees God, the ground of all things, with two manifest aspects. You have God the Father in the Christian Holy Trinity, as God in the Old Testament announces himself to Moses. He says, I am that I am, or I am who I am. I am. Me, a conscious, subjective consciousness in the present, conscious being, is the ultimate, you couldn't put it more simply than that, conscious being, as the ground of all things. But this conscious being has two manifestations. The first appears right at the very beginning of the book of Genesis. The earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God moved on the face of the deep, or the face of the waters. The Spirit is the same word, ruach in Hebrew, pneuma in Greek, means wind and breath. And the wind moves on the face of the deep. Basically like the wind blowing on the sea here, it creates waves. So vibrations or waves caused by the movement of the Spirit the first manifestation of creation. And then immediately after that, and God said, let there be light. So the word of God, the spoken word, the formation of words which themselves have forms, is the second, these two manifestations of God, the Spirit and the Word. And this is the basis of the Christian Holy Trinity. The Holy Trinity is God the Father is the ground of all being. The Spirit is the moving principle, the breath, the wind, the energy in the universe. And the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, is the principle of word, form, name. And it's the way in which the Greek idea from Plato of the world of ideas or forms was included in Christian theology. So you have this idea of the names and forms. You have the idea of the moving principle of the Spirit and the ground of being. As the ground of being gives rise to the Spirit and the names and forms, but they're not separate from each other. The principal metaphor is speaking. In the Jewish and Christian tradition, and Islamic tradition too, and Hindu tradition, that when you speak, there's a flow of breath. When I speak now, there's a flow of breath. But there's also the words which have form, shape, pattern, structure, interconnection. Each has a definite form, which is why speech recognition software can work. Each word has a different particular form, even when any one of us saying the same word could be recognized by an artificial intelligence system. Because the words have forms. So if I just have the breath, there's a flow of energy but no form. If I just have the ideas or the words, they're silent in my mind, they don't manifest. But when I'm speaking now, the two go together. I'm the speaker, the breath is the Spirit, the words are the word or the Logos. And that's the principal metaphor on which the Judeo-Christian model of ultimate consciousness is based. And so when we look at the whole of nature in that light, we find that what science shows us is there's a ground of all being. There's an energetic principle called energy, which underlies everything in the universe, the principle of activity, movement, and change. And there's a formative principle called fields, which shape everything in nature. The gravitational field shapes the sun and the moon, the electromagnetic fields shape light energy, and they shape many other things. The formative fields of living organisms shape the living organisms. The quantum matter fields of quantum theory shape electronic particles, nuclear particles, atoms, molecules. So fields give form, and energy gives activity or actuality or the potential to make changes in things. So that's reflected also in our scientific understanding of nature, this basic pattern. And so when we look at spiritual practices, we find that actually they relate to different aspects of this Trinitarian model. Meditation is primarily about reaching the ground of consciousness itself, Sat, the ground of being, or the knower. Everything we know is encompassed within the know. It's rather like the screen of your computer. Everything you can read or see on the computer depends on that screen, but the screen itself doesn't have a particular content. It's the ground of all the things you can see and experience. And the ground of our consciousness is that. It's that which enables us to know. And through meditation, through letting go of the contents of consciousness, we can become aware of that ground of consciousness itself. So that contacts with this basic ground of being. Then I think that dynamic spiritual practices like sports, dancing, and singing connect us with that principle of flow, the spirit, which is all about movement and change. It's the dynamical principle. And I think that spiritual practices involve the appreciation of beauty, for example, the beauty of flowers. When you contemplate the beauty of a flower, you're contemplating the beauty of a form, and its interconnections and interrelations with things. And when you look at beautiful architecture or beautiful works of visual art, painting or sculpture, you're primarily relating to the logos aspect or the chit aspect of ultimate consciousness, the contents of consciousness, that which is known. And then some spiritual practices they all involve all three, but some emphasize some more than others. A visionary psychedelic experience where there's a continually changing series of forms. You have both the aspect of spirit, of flow and change, and also the aspect of form. And so you do with poetry and with the flow of words in spoken language, as with singing. So I think that it's possible to see a kind of common map behind these different practices, and I think these different practices connect us with this ultimate consciousness in different ways. And again, to come back to my original point, it's not that one works, that meditation is the answer, for example, and sports are not, or singing and dancing are not. I think they all work. And I think that some of them are more easily done alone. Meditation, for example, is most easily done alone. But others require other people. Chanting, rituals, singing, celebration of holy days and festivals, a collective. And I think that I myself think of myself as both spiritual and religious, because I don't see those as alternatives either. Some people think that religion's all just about dogma and spirituality is about experience. Actually, I think that I think religion ultimately is about experience. It starts from experience. The Buddha didn't become enlightened through doing a PhD. He became enlightened through meditating under a tree. You know, Jesus didn't become aware of his connection with God, his intimate relationship with God, through studying in a rabbinical seminary. It was through his near-death experience of baptism and his visionary experiences in the desert that he became aware of it. So I think that's the ultimate basis of religion, but I think the strength of the religious traditions is that they're collective. They bring out the collective dimension which we all need, and some of these spiritual practices emphasize community, group, and interrelationship of families and communities. Others emphasize individual experience more, but again, it's not one or the other. It's, I think, both and. Anyway, this is just a brief overview of some of the themes. And my final point really is that I think at the moment we stand on the threshold of a completely new phase of spiritual evolution, which is a very exciting place to be, because we now have access to all these different spiritual traditions. Religions themselves are rapidly evolving at the moment. Spiritual traditions themselves are evolving. Yoga, for example, which when I was a child, I'd never heard of it. It was more or less confined to India and to a few theosophists. But it's now everywhere. And that itself is evolving. And I was astonished a couple of weeks ago at Hollyhock to find the yoga on paddleboard workshop going on, where people are now doing yoga on paddleboards, and it's a completely new way of doing yoga and experiencing balance. And so that evolutionary process is happening right here at Hollyhock. In fact, I think Hollyhock is one of the places which is catalyzing this process of spiritual evolution. And I think we're all part of that. And I think it's a great time to be alive. Thank you. Good, so we started half an hour late, so it's getting a bit late. If you have to leave, feel free. But there's time for about 25 minutes of questions and Q&A and discussion. And there's a microphone, so if you'd like to say anything, please make yourself known and you'll get the mic.
Any questions? Question for Rupert?
Okay.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you, Rupert. I'm really curious to go back to your sort of chapter and wrap on psychedelics, and I'm wondering, like, agreed that through psychedelics and through marijuana you can have beautiful spiritual experiences, and we're sort of living in a time and in a society that, you know, ritualizing something, you know, drugs, is like completely frowned upon and no one talks about it. And many people take these things simply to have fun or because they're bored or to be numbed to what's going on in the world and come to rely on them for peace of mind. And so I'm just sort of curious what you think about that and how these really magical and potent plants can be used in a good and healthy way.
Well, it's a really important question. You see, you know that Karl Marx famously said that religion is the opium of the people. Well, in fact, we now live in a society where opioids are the opium of the people, and drugs can certainly be abused, and a lot of people are hooked on antidepressants, painkillers, and all sorts of other drugs, whether they're prescription drugs or not. Many people are hooked on tobacco and other addictive substances. So there are many which started out as a sacred substance in Native American culture. So there are many ways in which they can be work in a negative way. I think the challenge is to find ways in which they can take on this positive role. I think this recent surge of research on psychedelics is very important because now there's legal research. It's possible to find out more about what's happening. It's also become clear that for many people with addiction problems, psychedelics can actually help them. Psilocybin, iboga, and other plants are actually of proven worth, much greater proven worth than many other ways of dealing with addictions. In Britain, there's a trial now going on with psilocybin for people with chronic depression. The people are only admitted into this trial if they've had 15 years of depression which hasn't been relieved by standard medical treatments, including antidepressants, visits to psychiatrists and so on, chronic depressive people. And the results are showing remarkable improvements. People are seeing a whole new way of relating to the world and to consciousness. So I think part of the change is happening through this legal psychedelic research, which is partly about therapeutic uses of psychedelics. MDMA is now being used in trials with people with post-traumatic stress disorder with impressive results. But I think the main challenge is to find ways of having these psychedelics done within a framework. I mean, it's been recognized from the beginning that set and setting are really important. The mindset and where you take them really affect what happens. So even if psilocybin's approved for treatment of depression, it's not going to work very well if people just go to see a psychiatrist who writes a prescription for psilocybin and says, okay, take this once a week. And it's not going to work very well if it's done that way, treated just like any other drug. So I think it's partly a matter of finding ways in which they can be done supportively and appropriately. There's one model that's occurring in Europe at the moment is in Holland. The magic mushroom, the underground part, the sclerotia, are legal in Holland through a loophole in the law, whereas the above ground part are not. So they have the same effect. So now the British Psychedelic Society is now organizing weekend retreats. You sign up, you have like a workshop group at places like Hollyhock. In Holland, where you have 20 people in the group, you have 2 or 3 facilitators who are experienced with this. People go for the weekend from England, it's legal. You have a day getting to know people, you set your intentions, what you hope to experience, and so forth. Then everyone takes a fairly high dose. And then the next day is debriefing, journaling, small group discussions, talking about it, and sort of relating it to the rest of your life. And then you go home. This is a weekend workshop with psilocybin in safe retreats with experienced people. This is a new model, and people in the capitalist world, investors, are now hovering. They think this is going to be a huge opportunity. Now cannabis is legal in countries like Canada, and there are companies worth billions of dollars. They think psilocybin is the next, and they're thinking of retreat centers, set chains of retreat centers. And personally, I'm not very keen on, big-scale capitalism getting involved with these things. I think it's better for them to be at least semi-illegal, decriminalized. If they're fully legal, then you have mass capitalism moving in. In California, 5 or 6 years ago, cannabis was a cottage industry, but now it's sort of industrial-scale production. But there are also, you see, these churches like the ayahuasca church in the Santo Daime that I mentioned, another one, Union de Vegetal, Union of Plants. That is now legal in the United States under the same conditions that the Native American church is legal. It's a religious ritual involving a psychedelic. I think that way is a much better way to go, to have ceremonial legalization with responsible people running these ceremonies. I look forward to the day when regular churches will have sort of psychedelic rites of passage for young people and stuff, but which they'd have to outsource it to the Santo Daime people to start with. But I don't see any reason why these things shouldn't be incorporated into rites of passage for those who are interested, and done properly, rather than people doing them under very, in parties when there are lots of drunk people around and no one knows what to do if someone freaks out, or at festivals where people can take overdoses or doses of dubious substances, they don't know what it is. The present situation is not very good, but I think it's possible to envisage something much better.
Hi, I'm Stephanie from Santa Monica. I was wondering if you've done any work with flower essences or with Paralandra, which is a nature center out of Virginia.
The short answer is no, I haven't. I mean, I love flower essential oils and flower scents, but I've never worked with flower essences. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
I heard you talk about the psychic being a horizontal level and the spiritual being outside or above. And I'm wondering what you've encountered in your research about a lower level or about openings to new levels of consciousness that one has not experienced before being negative or traumatic.
Well, I think that in all traditions it's acknowledged that there are negative spirits out there, devils, demons, jinns. And so not all beings that one might be open to through particularly psychedelic spiritual experiences are necessarily good. And I think a lot of people who take DMT or ayahuasca or mushrooms encounter entities, beings that seem to be autonomous beings. And it's not clear whether they're figments of their own imagination, whether they're autonomous entities, whether they're products of the collective unconscious. There's been so little research on this, it's not clear what they are. But in all cultures and traditions, there's the belief that there are negative forces there. So I think one of the things certainly when I take psychedelics, one of the things I do is pray first to ask for protection and guidance when this is happening. And I think if people go into these experiences completely unprotected, then they may be very vulnerable. Now, I've not myself tried to work out a taxonomy of these spirit beings, but I'm pretty sure, I know they exist. There's also the way in which there are collective creations. You see, in India, for example, the god Ganesh is a very important part of Hindu tradition. Ganesh is an elephant-headed god. Well, Ganesh couldn't have existed in any normal physical form. He's a kind of animal-human hybrid, and you find animal-human hybrids in these ancient cave paintings. It's a very ancient theme, a kind of shamanic theme. People pray to Ganesh, and lots of Hindus see Ganesh in their dreams. And I discovered online Hindu dream forums where people discuss their Ganesh dreams. Now, Ganesh is a product of the collective consciousness of Hinduism. You know, you see Ganesh pictures, statues, calendars with Ganesh on them and stuff. Very much part of their folklore and mythology. It becomes part of their collective life. So, does Ganesh really exist? Well, he exists in the sense he's not my personal fantasy if I have a dream of Ganesh. He's much more transpersonal than me. But is Ganesh nothing but a kind of part of the collective consciousness or unconsciousness of Hindus? Or could Ganesh also be that and a channel through which the divine can really flow into people's lives when awake or asleep? Again, I don't think it's either or. I think it can be both and. Well, say it again. I'll have another shot. But then we should move on to someone else. I'll do it briefly. You mean other people's traumatic experiences, animals' traumatic experiences?
That has a power that cannot be questioned once you've experienced it.
Oh, well, people certainly have spiritual experiences that are traumatic, yes. Spiritual emergencies is one name for them, yes. And not all spiritual experiences are pleasant. I mean, a central image in the Christian faith is Jesus being crucified on a cross. Well, that's pretty traumatic, and it's also spiritual. So, yes, and some people experience spiritual experiences through extreme pain and suffering. In fact, some people deliberately inflict it, like those people who, you know, lash themselves with whips and flagellate themselves and so on. So yes, pain and suffering are also a gateway to the spiritual realm. Okay, well, obviously, I think we have to move on. Anyone else? Yes.
Here, we've got. Yes, I have a question about, you said that animals are capable of psychic experience, but not about spiritual experience. Is that correct?
Animals?
Yes.
No, I said they may have both. I said that they have a lot of psychic powers, very often more than ours. But I think they may also have a spiritual dimension, like lizards basking in the sun.
Okay, I would totally agree with that, because I believe that they do have, because otherwise we would not have them, because we developed from them.
Yes.
And then I saw my cat dying, and I'm sure she prepared for it.
I think that, you know, when people in near-death experiences show that for many people the dying process can be blissful, and I rather suspect it's like that for animals as well, and that many animals die without fear, and when they die, it may well be they go through a blissful state similar to a human near-death experience. Of course, we can't prove that, but it seems to me quite likely. I don't see why it shouldn't be the case anyway.
Hello. I thought that a lot of the dynamic that you're presenting is maybe between worldview and integration of these spiritual practices. I appreciate the work you've done in the breadth of spiritual practice, but a lot of work that continues or begins with that is the integration of that into your life. And I'm asking as someone who sees things from a very different point of view, but from my experience, my point of view, the Western model is completely intolerant of spirit, and LSD in particular caused just untold, or the reaction to it brought out amazing hatred and destruction in this culture. And most of the How to Change Your Mind and the work you've done is, it just seems to be apologies. You know, the fact that that science now will admit that these things even happened, that's about as far as it goes. And so I'm just asking, as sort of an elder in this culture, how you can see it ever being able to integrate into, the fabric of the rhetoric, of what is known, and not just put off somewhere.
Well, I think we're moving towards that. I mean, I think the fact that we now have legal research on LSD, that there's a much more rational discussion of it, is a step in the right direction. I mean, it's not going to happen instantly. And I think there have to be social frameworks within which people can take it, which, where they can integrate it with the rest of their lives. Because there's no doubt that some people have psychotic experiences as a result of taking drugs, and they can't integrate them. So I think this is a project that we're only just seeing the beginning of. I don't know where it will all go, but I certainly don't think we've arrived at the end of this road. I think we're just at the beginning of it. Just one more. I hope so.
I have a question.
Just time one more, I think, yes.
Yeah, here.
Where
right over here.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you. I asked this question from a humble place of the unknown. In my lifetime, I was born into a culture that is a consumeristic culture, and our capacity to step outside of that and be non-destructive to our environment is fairly minimal. And I'm wondering if you, from your research or experience, believe that we have the capacity to turn this planet around, and that the mass extinction may or may not take us all out with it, or just your thoughts on that subject.
Easy question, yes. Well, obviously I don't know, but I mean, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because that's my nature and constitution, and also I think that if we become hopeless, if we despair, then that's disempowering. It's just so impossible to foresee what will happen. I mean, if things go on with the business as usual model, obviously it's going to be fairly disastrous. But there could be a lot of things that disrupt business as usual. Totally unexpected events of every kind. So, if you look at futuristic projections from the past, I mean, they nearly all turn out to be wrong, because things happen so unexpectedly. So I just think we don't know. I hope and pray that we'll be all right, but I think it's one of the things we have to pray about as well as hope about, as well as being as activist as we can about doing what we think will help to save us. I don't think that life on the planet is in danger. I think human civilization's in danger, and certainly luxurious consumerist lifestyles are in danger, and many other species. But, we have to hope, because what else can we do? So I think that has to be the end, because we've run over the normal ending time and it's late. So thank you all for coming.